This photo was taken inside a small storage room at the back of a house in Kent, England. The space is cluttered with all sorts of things, and in the middle of it all sits a wooden box. It looks homemade, built from a few pieces of pine and fitted with a cheap combination lock that's been screwed into the front. But this box wasn't part of the mess around it. It had a purpose that was far more disturbing than anyone could have expected. The safe belonged to a man called David Fuller. He was 67 years old, a father of 4, and had spent most of his life working as an electrician at hospitals across Kent and Sussex. He was quiet and dependable, keeping to himself and never causing any trouble. Outside of work, he had a handful of hobbies that made him seem even more ordinary. He liked bird watching, and he cycled on the weekends, regularly taking photographs of just about anything that caught his eye. Fuller had grown up in Deal, a small coastal town, and started his career with a 4-year apprenticeship for the Ministry of Defence. He married 3 times, and for a while he blended into a small community in Heathfield, living in a quiet cul-de-sac where no one had a reason to look twice at him. But Fuller's private life was more complicated than most people realised. He had multiple affairs, including a long relationship with a nurse he met through work. They would meet for drinks at a hospital social club, or go to concerts together. Their relationship ended only when Fuller left her for another woman. Worse still, 2 murders in Tunbridge Wells had already tied his name to something much darker in 1987, even if no one knew it at the time. In June of that year, 26-year-old Wendy Nell was living in a bedsit on Guildford Road. She had recently separated from her husband and was focused on her job at Super Snaps on Camden Road. Her boyfriend dropped her home one night, and she was never seen alive again. The next day she was found in her room, lying on her bed with blood covering the sheets. She had been physically assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Neighbours said they heard nothing, despite the thin walls in the building, and there were no clear signs of forced entry, but her diary and a set of keys were missing. An EFIT, which is a computer-generated image of a person who is believed to have committed a crime or who is missing, was produced, but it didn't lead anywhere. 6 months later, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce disappeared outside her home on Grosvenor Park. She worked at Buster Brown's, a busy restaurant in the town. On the night she vanished, several people reported hearing screams from her doorstep, but nothing came of it. She never made it inside. Her body was found 3 weeks later, 40 miles away in a drainage ditch on farmland in Romney Marsh. A tractor driver noticed her from the height of his cab. She had also been physically assaulted, beaten, and strangled, and her keys were missing as well. Both women worked on Camden Road, and both lived alone. They were attacked in ways that pointed to the same person, and detectives were confident the murders were linked. The issue, though, is that in the late 1980s, there wasn't any CCTV or mobile data to work with, and DNA analysis was still in its early stages. They collected what they could: a bloody fingerprint on a shopping bag, a footprint on a blouse, and biological samples, but none of it led to a suspect. By the end of the decade, the investigation had gone cold. The evidence was there, but the science at the time couldn't do much with it, and every attempt to match the samples taken from Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce led nowhere. That changed in 2019, when specialists began revisiting older material with methods that hadn't existed in the 80s. They were now able to recover DNA from samples that had degraded over time, including damaged material taken from Caroline's tights. Alongside that came another tool, something called familial DNA, which allowed investigators to look for relatives of an unknown offender rather than the offender himself. When they ran the samples through the national database, the pool of possible matches shrank from millions to a small group of families that shared certain markers with the profile taken from both scenes. Investigators worked through age, background, and anyone with links to Tunbridge Wells or Romney Marsh, slowly reducing the list until one name was left: David Fuller. In late 2020, investigators gave David Fuller a visit. From the outside, it looked like any other property on the street, aside from the number of CCTV cameras fixed around it. Inside, the search took time. Fuller kept almost everything. Old computers were stacked on shelves and hard drives stored in boxes. There were discs, phones, SIM cards, and more than 34,000 printed photographs. He kept invoices from maintenance work, diaries describing evenings out, and pictures from rides he had taken with a local cycling club. As investigators worked through the material, certain details began to stand out. The invoices placed Fuller in and around Tunbridge Wells for years, even though he claimed he barely knew the town. The diaries showed regular visits to Buster Brown's, where Caroline Pierce worked, and photographs and notes from his cycling trips showed that he often travelled through Romney Marsh, the same area where Caroline's body was found. And among the thousands of photographs he kept, one showed him lying in the grass on a sunny day with his feet upturned behind him. The pattern on the soles of his Clark's shoes matched the print left on Wendy's blouse. His fingerprints partially matched the mark found on a shopping bag in her room. And so, the DNA results confirmed the link. The sample from Caroline Pierce's tights matched Fuller's profile, and the material recovered from Wendy Nell's duvet placed him as the most likely source by a huge margin. After 33 years, investigators finally had a name. But the search of the house continued. There were still hundreds of hard drives, memory cards, and more than 2,000 obsolete discs to go through. Then, investigators opened a cupboard in one of the rooms. A cabinet had been pushed tightly against the back wall. When they moved it, they found a small fixture screwed into the rear panel. It was a makeshift safe, and inside of it was 4 hard drives. When they started going through those drives, the focus of the investigation changed completely. Instead of finding material linked only to the murders, detectives found videos Fuller had filmed himself. The footage showed him inside hospital mortuaries, using his position at work to gain access to areas that were supposed to be secure. You see, Fuller had an employee swipe card that allowed him to move freely around the buildings. The mortuary was one of the places he could enter without raising suspicion. At the newer hospitals, the fridges where bodies were kept had doors at both ends. One side was covered by CCTV. The other, where post-mortem examinations took place, had no cameras at all, and it seemed like Fuller knew this. He pleasured himself using the bodies stored inside those fridges, and using a small camera, filmed it all. Investigators were able to pause the footage and read the details on the wristbands of the patients, and compared the timestamps and metadata from the files with mortuary logs, matching each clip to the person who had been in that fridge at that time. Fuller even kept a small black notebook where he kept a list of the names of people he abused. As investigators kept going, they found more and more of the same thing. Fuller went into the fridges at times when staff had already gone home. He stayed there for long periods of time, and in some cases, he came back to the same bodies on multiple days. But that's not all. Officers found around 4 million images of explicit material in total. Most of those were downloads, including a large amount of CSAM, which on its own would have been one of the biggest collections police had ever encountered. But mixed into that were more than 800,000 images and over 500 videos that Fuller had created himself, documenting his necrophilic offences across both hospitals. By the time officers finished counting, there were more than 100 people he abused. Some were elderly, and some were children. The oldest was 100, and the youngest was just 9 years old. By the time the case reached court in 2021, there was nothing left for Fuller to deny. He admitted to killing 25-year-old Wendy Nell and 20-year-old Caroline Pierce in separate attacks in Tunbridge Wells back in 1987. He also pleaded guilty to 44 further offences involving the abuse of 78 dead women and girls between 2008 and 2020, all connected to the mortuary abuse uncovered on his drives. After that conviction, the investigation continued. More victims were identified and more files were reviewed. Fuller was charged again, this time for offences against 23 additional women aged between 45 and 92, 10 of whom have never been identified. He admitted to those charges as well. They included 12 counts of inappropriate acts with a corpse and 4 counts related to the possession of extreme adult content, all committed between 2007 and 2020. In October 2021, he was charged with 16 more mortuary offences linked to both the Old Kent and Sussex Hospital and the newer site in Pembury. He pleaded guilty to those charges in November 2022. For the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, Fuller was given a whole life order. That sentence was handed down on the 15th of December 2021, meaning he will never be released. The later offences added further years to his sentence, though they no longer changed the outcome. He's currently held at HMP Frankland, alongside other high-profile offenders. In the end, the only reason any of this came to light was because of the murders he committed more than 30 years earlier. If the DNA work hadn't moved forward the way it did, Fuller would never have been connected to either case, and none of the material inside his house would have been found. He would have carried on living the same life he always had, and no one would have known what he had been doing inside those hospitals. Since the case became public, the NHS has paid over £3.2 million to more than 150 families. But for the people whose relatives were involved, that doesn't change anything. What Fuller did can't be undone, and the damage didn't stop with the people he targeted. Their families have to live with the knowledge of what happened, and that's something they don't get to walk away from. And when you look back at that image of the safe sitting in the corner of his storage room, it's difficult to see it the same way again. It isn't just a box he built for himself. It's the reason anyone knows what Fuller was doing, and the reason so many families had to hear the truth about what happened to the people they lost. For a long time, it was the one place he thought no one would ever look. Now, it's the part of this story that's hardest to forget. This photo started appearing around Saldanha Bay in early 2024, a missing poster pinned to shop windows and street poles, showing a young girl with blue-green eyes and a pale complexion. We're given very little information about her current whereabouts or what's happened to her, but the story behind this picture didn't follow the path people expected. And as more details surfaced, it became clear that the reason she disappeared was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Joshlin Smith was 7 years old at the time, living in Saldanha Bay, a coastal town about 120 kilometres or around 75 miles north of Cape Town. On the surface, it looks calm enough, known mostly for its fishing and the wildflowers that appear across the reserve in spring. But once you move away from the coastline, the layout of the town starts to change. South Africa still carries the effects of apartheid in the way its towns were built, and Saldanha is no different. The wealthier homes sit near the water, and further inland are the neighbourhoods that were shaped by years of unequal development. Diazville is one of them, made up of government-subsidised brick houses. Beyond that is Middelpos, where Joshlin lived with her mother, her mother's boyfriend, and her siblings. That area is a mix of small reconstruction and development programme homes, and corrugated shacks put up on open ground. Many of the families there live with very little, and people notice unfamiliar cars or faces immediately. But on the 19th of February 2024, everything changed. Joshlin was at home in Middelpos that morning. She wasn't feeling well, so her mother, Kelly Smith, kept her out of school. Kelly later said she left Joshlin in the care of her boyfriend, Giaconopolis, and went out. But when she returned, Joshlin was gone. The search began the next day. Police, K9 units, volunteers, NGOs, helicopters, and rescue boats covered the surrounding areas, moving through fields, dunes, and the coastline around Saldanha Bay. But nothing was found. On March 2nd, clothing believed to belong to a young girl was discovered in an open field in Diazville, and some of the items appeared to be stained with blood. The search intensified again, with the South African Navy joining the teams already on the ground. Drones were sent up, and dogs were brought back in, but there was still no sign of Joshlin. On March the 5th, 3 people were taken into custody. Two of them reportedly confessed when questioned, but the third wouldn't say anything at all. And while police didn't release the details publicly, the message was clear. Whatever happened to Joshlin didn't come from outside the home. It came from the people closest to her. 2 days later, on March 7th, the case broke open. Kelly Smith, her boyfriend Jacques Annapolis, their friend Stephen Van Ryn, and a woman identified as a Sangoma, otherwise known as a traditional healer, were brought into the Vredendal Magistrates Court. By then, the small shack where Joshlin lived was locked up and empty. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse calling for answers, as people who had supported Kelly during the early days of the search now questioned everything she had said. Kelly Smith faced charges of kidnapping and human trafficking. Prosecutors said she arranged her daughter's disappearance with her boyfriend and their friend in exchange for money. All three pleaded not guilty when the trial began in a sports hall in Saldanha Bay. From the start, the testimony was hard to listen to. The worst part came from a neighbour, Laurencia Lombard, who had turned state witness. She told the court that Kelly said she had done something silly and sold Joshlin to a Sangoma. According to her, the person who took the child wanted her for her eyes and her skin. Sangomas are traditional healers in South Africa, but not everyone who uses the title is legitimate. Some have been involved in rituals that use body parts, sold as charms, or for so-called medicines. With the claims being made in court, investigators began looking even closer at the people around Joshlin. Another claim came from a pastor who said he heard Kelly talk about selling her children for 20,000 rand each, which is around £800 or $1,200, and that she was willing to settle for far less. Then Joshlin's teacher came forward. She told the court that during the search, Kelly told her the child was already on a ship, inside a container, heading toward West Africa. More than 30 witnesses testified during the 8-week trial. Kelly and the others didn't take the stand, and they didn't call anyone to speak for them. When the verdict was read, Kelly wiped tears from her face. Van Ryn smiled. Judge Nathan Erasmus found all three guilty of human trafficking and sentenced them to life in prison. They also received 10 years for kidnapping. Police said the search for Joshlin would continue, but as of this video, she's still not been found. Joshlin's disappearance is already hard enough to understand. A 6-year-old girl who vanished in the middle of the day and never came home. But the part that stayed with people isn't just that she was taken, it's who arranged it and why. The case focuses on a belief system that's led to some of the most disturbing crimes in parts of Africa, where children have been taken and harmed for rituals carried out by individuals posing as traditional healers. These practices are rare, but they exist, and they've left police across the continent dealing with cases where young victims were targeted specifically for their features. Hearing that be a possible cause for Joshlin's disappearance changed the tone completely. But none of this has brought her home. It hasn't answered the questions her family and community still ask every day, and it hasn't explained what really happened after she left that house for the last time. It only shows how far this case has drifted from a missing child search and into something far more unsettling. And more than a year later, she still hasn't been found. We can hope that changes one day, but right now, no one knows where she is or what became of her. This photo was taken in July 2022, inside a plane, just before a woman left Kenya for work in Saudi Arabia. She's standing between the seats and wearing the shirt from the recruitment agency that arranged her a job. At the time, there was no reason to believe it would matter. She was travelling for work, planning to send money home, and expecting to return once her contract ended. But this image would end up carrying far more weight than anyone realised at the time. The woman in the image was Eunice Achieng. She was 32 years old, a mother of 2, and the firstborn in a family of 8. Her home was in Eldama Ravine, in Baringo County in Kenya, where most days looked the same and opportunities were limited. Eunice had been without steady work for some time, picking up menial jobs where she could, and after leaving her marriage, she came back to Eldama Ravine to stay with family during the COVID period. When restrictions eased up, she told her mother she'd been put in contact with an agent who could take her to Saudi Arabia to work. For domestic work in Kenya, the pay is often between 18 and 33,000 Kenyan shillings a month, roughly £100 to £200, or $150 to $250. For many families, that amount barely covers the basics, if that. School fees, rent, food, transport, there's nothing left over, and no real way to plan beyond the next month. So, on any given day at Nairobi's international airport, it isn't unusual to see women in the departures area wearing matching shirts from recruitment agencies, taking photos together and talking about what they plan to do once they start earning. The offer they're given is usually the same: a 2-year contract in Saudi Arabia with regular pay, money to send home, and the chance to finally get ahead instead of constantly trying to catch up. Before Eunice left, there was already disagreement at home. Her mother, Praxidis Okia, didn't want her to go. Her mother warned her against it, and Eunice said she wouldn't. Then, a short time later, she claimed she'd found work in Nairobi instead. But that wasn't true. What her family didn't know at the time was that she had already entered training arranged by the recruitment agency, preparing to leave the country. Praxidis only found out Eunice had gone to Saudi Arabia days later, not from Eunice herself, but from her other daughter. By then, the decision had already been made. In June 2022, with that same goal, Eunice travelled to Saudi Arabia to work as a housekeeper, leaving her 2 children behind with family and believing the separation would be temporary in a situation where there were very few alternatives. Throughout June and into July, they stayed in contact as she settled into the job. Then, in August 2022, her father, Michael Ongalo, received a call that didn't sound like the others. Eunice told him her life was in danger. She said her employer was being aggressive, saying that he had threatened to kill her and throw her body in a water tank. Her final words were, "Please save me," before the call was abruptly cut short. That phone call was the last time Eunice ever spoke to her family. When it ended, they were left not knowing where she was or what had happened to her. The only thing they had left of her was the final image she had taken on her flight heading to Saudi Arabia. The first place they turned was the recruitment agency that had arranged her job. They told them what Eunice had said on the phone and asked them to check on her. The explanation they were given didn't answer much. The agent said Eunice had been taken away by 4 women who spoke Swahili, and that after that, no one knew where she'd gone. After that, the family heard nothing more. For months, they were left believing their daughter was missing somewhere in Saudi Arabia, with no way to reach her and no information coming back. But what they didn't know at the time was that Eunice Achieng was already dead. According to Saudi records, she died on October 5, 2022, only weeks after the phone call where she said her employer had threatened to kill her and throw her into a water tank. Her body was found in a rooftop water tank, and Saudi health officials later said it was too decomposed to determine how she died. Police recorded the case as a natural death and closed it. None of that was communicated to her family at the time. It wasn't until mid-2024, when they tried again to get answers through immigration officials, that they were told Eunice had died. Even then, the information didn't line up. The date they were given placed her death in March 2024, nearly 2 years after the call that had sent them into panic. Not long after the family learned the truth about her death, the story was published by a local media outlet. That report caught the attention of a US-based activist who investigates cases involving missing foreign workers. He contacted the family through the journalist who had written the piece and told them he had been trying to locate them, as he had some information that previously hadn't been disclosed to the family. Her death was officially recorded as unclear, and her body had remained in a Saudi morgue for over 2 years. A death certificate confirmed it, but it didn't explain how or why it happened, or why her family had been left believing she was still alive for so long. When Eunice's body was eventually returned to Kenya, a post-mortem was carried out at Mercy Mission Morgue by Baringo County pathologist Dr. Wangari Wambugu. She concluded that Eunice died due to lack of oxygen. There were no visible injuries, and because of the level of decomposition, it wasn't possible to determine whether any organs had been removed. As unfortunate as Eunice's case is, it isn't an exception. Stories like hers have been coming out for years, often following the same pattern. In Uganda, a man named Isiko Moses Waiswa was told his wife had died while working in Saudi Arabia. When he contacted her employer, he was given a choice. He could either have her body returned or receive the $2,800 in wages she was owed. He said he didn't care about the money. He just wanted his wife's body back. A Saudi autopsy later found that she was severely underweight, with extensive bruising, 3 broken ribs, and burns on her ear, hand and feet that appeared consistent with electrocution. Despite that, her death was officially recorded as natural causes. In another case, a young mother jumped from a 3rd-floor roof while trying to escape her employer and broke her back. Another woman said her employer forced himself on her and then sent her home pregnant. Over the past 5 years, at least 274 Kenyan workers have died in Saudi Arabia, according to an investigation by the New York Times. Most of them were women, and most of them were young, while working in jobs that aren't considered dangerous. The investigation also found that staffing agencies in Kenya, Uganda, and Saudi Arabia continued operating, despite repeated reports of abuse and deaths. Some of those agencies were owned or backed by powerful figures, with no reason to disrupt the system. Members of the Saudi royal family were identified as major investors in companies placing domestic workers. Nearly every staffing agency contacted during the investigation refused to answer questions or ignored repeated requests for comment. The agencies involved present overseas work as safe and well managed, promising stability and opportunity to people willing to leave everything behind. When problems surface, that image rarely matches what families are left dealing with. Calls go unanswered, explanations change, and responsibility seems to disappear. The people being recruited are often those with the least room to refuse. Women supporting children, families living month to month, people willing to travel thousands of miles for work that pays more than anything available at home, even if it means living somewhere unfamiliar, speaking a language they don't know, and relying entirely on systems they can't see. Eunice Achieng was one of them. She left believing the risk was worth it, believing she was making a temporary sacrifice for her children, and believing that if something went wrong, someone would step in. The photo taken on that plane was never meant to be a goodbye, but it's the last clear image anyone has of her before she vanished into a system that offered no protection, no answers, and no way out.